Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our panel today entitled Arab-Israeli Normalization, Is it a Viable Avenue Towards Peace? I'm Desha Jarrad, the director of the Conflict Resolution Program here at Georgetown, and we're honored to be co-sponsoring this panel with the Middle East Institute. We've had around 500 people RSVP to join us today, so welcome to all. Our mission in the Conflict Resolution Program is to find ways to address and solve conflict. We do this by developing and teaching the cutting edge in the theory of conflict resolution, and then by teaching our students the skills and practice and policy surrounding mediation, facilitation, and negotiation. We're motivated by the notion that conflict is an opportunity to learn about each other and to create greater strength, and to find imaginative solutions through understanding. So please stay in touch with us for future panels and events through our website, Twitter, and Instagram accounts. 3 of our students with a deep interest in Arab-Israeli issues have organized this panel, bringing together participants with just extensive background and expertise on the region. So thank you to our students, Jordan Newmark, Talia Safar, and Megan Selway for your marvelous work on this. And I'd like to introduce and thank Joyce Crum, who will be moderating the panel. Joyce is a senior correspondent at The National, and she's long expertly covered American foreign policy, and importantly has a master's degree in conflict resolution. So also serves as a wonderful example to our students of how you can translate the degree into a very meaningful example of a career. So this promises to be a fascinating discussion. Thank you all for being here, and over to you, Joyce.
Unmute. Thank you, Dr. Giraud. Thank you, Georgetown and the Middle East Institute for organizing this timely event. Thanks to the students, Talia, Megan, and Jordan. It was great working with you leading up to today. So we have an exciting hour ahead to discuss a major groundbreaking event in the Middle East that took place 8 months ago, known as the Abraham Accords. These accords led to full or partial normalization of ties between the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, and Israel. Are these a viable vehicle for peace, or should they be interpreted in context of collective security, economic integration, and changed geopolitics? We have an excellent panel to go over these questions. Mickey Bergman, Vice President and Executive Director of the Richardson Center for Global Engagement, Khalid Al-Gindi, Senior Fellow and Director of the Program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli Affairs at MEI, Lucy Kurtzer Ellenbogen, Director of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict Program at the United States Institute of Peace, and last but not least, Mohammed Sulaiman, a non-resident scholar at MEI and Senior Associate at the Middle East and North Africa practice at McLarty Associates. So to just start more broadly on this question, basically the impact of the Abraham Accords. What changed? What do you see that has changed in the last 8 months? Mickey, if I can start with you on the regional picture, and then maybe perhaps Lucy and Khalid can jump in and tell us what changed on the Palestinian-Israeli scene. And Mohammed, if you can address the changes in the Gulf region and North Africa. So Mickey, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Joyce, and thank you for everybody for joining and the organizers on this. Let me start. I'll do it a little bit in pieces for me, and I'll try to be very quick. And first is to try and understand a little bit of the Israeli mindset as it's looking at the situation regionally, and then I'll try and go into the others as well. the Israelis see their threat not within the Palestinians at this point. They see the threat beyond the Palestinians. They see the threat from Iran. They see the threat from the region. Israelis also see the opportunity beyond the Palestinians, and that has always been the case. For the Israelis, the peace camp in Israel for years have been telling Israelis, hey, if we only do X, Y, and Z, if we only give up land, establish a Palestinian state, then we will get not peace with the Palestinians, but recognition in our neighborhood and being a part of the neighborhood. And that has been the selling point. And so these accords kind of put an interesting twist in that, because Israel is getting recognition, getting normalization without doing what it's supposed to be doing with the Palestinian negotiations. So from an Israeli perspective, obviously, they're looking at it as a win, and it changes the sense of urgency. We can talk about the Israeli-Palestinian front a little bit later, but it changes the urgency in Israel when it comes to Palestinians. Then on the other countries that are involved in this, UAE and Sudan and Morocco and Bahrain, Hisham Melham, the great Hisham, just did an article. I just read it this morning. It was exactly, I think, right, as looking at this as very opportunistic and riding on their perspective. Each of these countries got something in return. And when they got into it, it could be seen as a bet on Donald Trump's presidency and his continued presidency. But at the same time, it also was a hedge against the Donald Trump loss and a Joe Biden presidency. And I think we're seeing the alignment of it now. On the specifics, we know, arms deals with the UAE, Sudan off the terror list, Morocco with the recognition of sovereignty over Western Sahara. You see those kind of wins. So that's one thing for them. But for the UAE, for example, I'll focus on the UAE, to actually get those deals with the US and get that technology in, it's not only to the advantage of the UAE, but it's also a hedge against an American shift and withdrawal of interest from the Middle East further than what it has been over the last few years, because now you're holding the top of the line American technology. You're going to force American engagement and continued American engagement in the region. And of course, the big elephant in the room of what has been changing over the last few months since Biden took over is the front with Iran and the renewed US engagement with Iran, an attempt to go back to the JCPOA and other agreements in Iran. And we can see how everybody's trying to reorient themselves on this. And I think that's the game plan that is happening now. So having almost an alliance, and Saudis put, even though Saudi did not normalize relations with Israel, the Crown Prince was very much involved in the formation of these agreements.
The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, you're saying,
correct,
was involved in the...
Yeah, probably not directly, but you know that the UAE would not have moved without his nod and blessing.
Okay, and just to emphasize, the Biden administration, do you see it sort of taking a continuity approach on the Abraham Accords?
So we've seen, that's a great point, because if they put a bet to hedge on a Biden case, is it working? Let's see. Biden is keeping the arms deals with the UAEs, letting them move forward. Biden just announced that they're not going to reverse Trump's recognition on Western Sahara. So that's moving forward. And Sudan is being removed from the list. So yes, there's a continuation with this. What goes into the calculation within the Biden administration of whether to shift, to move, to withdraw, it probably has a lot to do, not specifically with the agreements, but more with the attempt to reestablish the United States credibility of saying, when we sign an agreement, we stick with it.
Okay. Khalid and Lucy, how do you see the accords shaping the Palestinian-Israeli front? Khalid, did this move the needle at all on peace between Palestinians and Israelis, or is it perhaps pressuring the Palestinian Authority in a certain direction?
Well, I think it certainly created pressure on the Palestinian leadership. And we saw that immediately, just the Palestinian response across the political spectrum was extremely negative. The PA officially, responded by withdrawing their ambassadors to the UAE and Bahrain, and of course they were later reinstated. But there was a pretty broad Palestinian consensus that this was a bad thing. And one thing that it did sort of on the internal Palestinian scene was basically push Palestinians to close ranks. I think for most of the Palestinian national movement, they saw these normalizations as an existential threat to the Palestinian national project. And so we saw this, immediate reconciliation significantly that took place in Turkey, sort of part of this, realignment happening in the region. Hamas and Fatah agreed to hold elections. Of course, since then we've seen that election plan has fallen apart, but for completely unrelated reasons. But the initial impetus for the elections was, I think, these normalization efforts, because there was a sense that this Palestinian division and Palestinian dysfunction had gone on too long. So that's on one level. In terms of at a more strategic level, clearly it robbed the Palestinians of one of the very few points of leverage that they had vis-a-vis Israel, and that was Arab normalization. I mean, as Mickey said, the expectation was Arab states would normalize with Israel only after a Palestinian state, after ending the occupation, or at least in some sort of agreement to that effect. And so, this kind of deepened the already pretty stark power asymmetry between the two sides. And so in that sense, I think not only has it not facilitated the goal of two states or helped Palestinians, I think it's done quite the opposite. And I think it's at least partly by design. Certainly from the Israeli standpoint, and from the Trump administration standpoint at the time, the goal was to bypass the Palestinians, to marginalize the Palestinians, and maybe in the end kind of force them unwillingly to go along with whatever new arrangement, the Trump plan, peace to prosperity, or whatever it was, sort of being imposed on them from the outside. Obviously, that hasn't, the Trump administration has left, but we still see this commitment to maintaining these agreements. I think there is a lot of spin that happens in the sense that people want to believe that these are opening possibilities or opportunities for peace, when frankly I think they do quite the opposite. If anything, the move toward normalization, I think, represents one of the many trends that are moving against two states, in the sense that basically what Arab states are saying is we cannot simply wait around forever, either to pursue our bilateral interests or to pursue other geopolitical interests. We're not going to wait for this unicorn called a two-state solution to happen in order to pursue those interests, whether they're Iran or whether they're strictly bilateral, or the quid pro quos that we saw with regard to Sudan and Morocco. So I see the normalizations really as the Arab world sort of washing their hands of a two-state solution.
But on that point, and we have a question that's actually very relevant, how what we saw in 2020 different from what we've seen in 78 between Egypt and Israel, and then in 1994 between Jordan and Israel? Those were also normalization agreements. So what is different this time specifically for the Palestinians?
I guess I'll take a quick stab at that, and I'm sure Lucy has more to say. I mean, what's different is that those were, the Egypt agreement and the Jordanian agreement, those were peace treaties. These were two countries that were physically, directly at war with Israel. and had a stake in the conflict, had taken casualties. Shots were fired across the, land was occupied. So, Egypt obviously got the Sinai Peninsula back as part of the, the Land for Peace formula. It's very different than what we've seen in any of these agreements. None of these four countries has ever been involved in a conflict with Israel militarily. And for a long time, at least a few of them have had kind of under the table relations with the Israelis anyway. So I think the number one difference is that those were actual peace treaties, whereas these are transactional, opportunistic, geopolitical. I mean, in a lot of ways, they're consecrating an existing geopolitical order that was under the table and is now above ground. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I see Lucy nodding her head. So over to you, on the same question, what changed and how do you see these agreements as different from past normalization deals with Israel?
Sure. Thank you, Joyce. And thank you again to all the organizers, and particularly Jordan, Megan, and Talia for putting this discussion together. So Mickey and Khaled have covered a lot of ground, but I think I'll pick up where Khaled left off and to your last question to him, which is the distinction. I mean, one of the big distinctions, other than the primary one actually that Khaled has pointed to, the distinction in the agreements between, say, Egypt and Jordan with Israel, and then this recent round of agreements, is that these also came after the Arab Peace Initiative. And in that sense, when you ask what has changed is an entire paradigm that was put forward by the Arab Peace Initiative, an initiative of the Saudis, the early 2000s, where the paradigm was no further. Egypt and Jordan already had peace agreements with Israel, but no normalization with Israel until the creation of a Palestinian state and an Israeli-Palestinian negotiated agreement under the terms laid out in the Arab Peace Agreement. So one big thing has changed is that paradigm is affirmatively gone. That said, what has not changed is even with that paradigm gone, these states, all these states, including those who've just gone into agreements, have not yet let go, certainly not rhetorically, and in articulating a commitment to the principle underlying the Arab Peace Initiative, which is a two-state solution. So you still have these states saying that that is the end goal. As I think Khaled has raised, was that the primary reason that the states went into these agreements with Israel? No, these were very much driven by domestic interests and bilateral interests. But it is still, I think, significant and meaningful, and maybe we'll get to that when we talk about the social cohesion question, that these states still feel a need to talk about the end game vision of two states. In terms of what else has changed since then on the ground? I mean, unfortunately, on the ground, in the case of the Israeli and Palestinian dynamic, not a whole lot has changed. The Palestinians certainly see no nearer hope to achieving a state. Khaled has already gone into that. I think they've seen themselves squeezed. I do think it has probably brought the Palestinians to assess their relations with the Arab world. I think that this was maybe a failure of calculation on the part of the Palestinians. And I think it underscores a dynamic that's been very interesting as the Palestinians have focused on international outreach over many years. A lot of that outreach and engagement has been to the US, to European actors. There's probably been less outreach and engagement and less than there maybe needed to be to Arab allies, whether it's leadership or public level. So I think that's probably a calculation that you see being considered, or I hope might be being considered in terms of the Palestinian calculus. And of course it does, what has changed is this question, these kinds of discussions that many of us are having of certainly these agreements were entered into with a view to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If anything, it underscored the fact that so many of these actors just don't see that as a priority or a realistic proposition. But it has raised these questions of, does it present new opportunities? When and if the political will exists, is there more leverage now created? And again, something we can get into later in the conversation, but does Israel now have more to lose with some of these Arab actors, should these Arab actors choose to use this leverage to push towards progress on the Israeli-Palestinian front? I think there are opportunities here, but I do not think these actors right now see a ripe context for trying to push any of those forward.
You mentioned the Arab Peace Initiative. I'm just curious, where is the viability of that initiative now, given that it's you know, the main formula it put in place is just openly shattered? You know, land for peace basically before normalization, and that hasn't happened from 4 major Arab countries normalizing. So do you see the document being amended in any way, or you know, changed to bring back that viability, or are we looking at a completely different you know, situation now?
Well, I would just say maybe Mohammed might have more to say on this question. What I would say is that yes, the paradigm, as mentioned at the top of my remarks, is gone. But for that matter, even when the Arab Peace Initiative was signed, as we've discussed, Egypt and Jordan already had peace agreements with Israel. There has been, and Khaled alluded to this, varying degrees of under the table, covert, not so covert engagement with Israel by some of these countries over time anyway. So as the API is structured currently, that paradigm is certainly gone. But the question which I think you raise is, if it is correct that the underlying goal of the API, which is to achieve a 2-state solution, remains the goals of these actors, is there a restructuring at some point? Is there an arrangement if political will and the leadership alignment is seen to be there, in which one could imagine these Arab states, even those who are in agreements with Israel, putting forward incentives for furthering the state of their relations in exchange for progress by both parties, Israeli and Palestinian? Can that relationship that's now, if it's strengthened with the Palestinians by some of these Arab states and now strengthened with Israelis, can it be used as leverage to ask for steps, concessions by both of those parties to move towards in a more constructive direction? I think there are possibilities there. Again, a lot of contextual pieces would need to fall into place for the impetus for this to be for the cost benefit analysis to work in favor of that happening.
Okay, Mohammed, if we move to the GCC region, these are the first agreements between GCC countries and Israel. What has changed there? I mean, we're seeing flights, we're seeing visits, we're seeing embassies being open. How do you see the changes as an observer of the region? And I have a question: do you see Qatar and Kuwait joining as well in the near future?
Thank you, Joyce. I really appreciate the work that Jordan, Talia, and Megan did to organize such a panel. Let me start by saying that geopolitics is back, and there's that kind of recognition in Arab capitals in North Africa that the world order that dominated the region and the world since the downfall of the Soviet Union until, let's say, 2015, 2016, the election of Donald Trump is over. And that means that America has less political capital and willingness to invest in a lot of problems around the world. And there's also another recognition that America is leaving everything behind for the Indo-Pacific. Everything is Indo-Pacific. This is the new game in town. And in order to reorganize the region in a post-US dominated architecture, we need to solve certain problems and realign with certain forces. And that not only the Arab-Israeli new peace deals, we're speaking about new moves being there between Arab capitals and Moscow, Beijing, New Delhi, and Israel was a bigger part of that kind of picture. So why Israel? I would say you have the Iranian factor, the Iranian threat that exists there. America is disengaged in the Gulf. We have a lot of rhetoric in Washington about ending the forever wars and lowering the tensions with Iran. And that makes Gulf capitals very anxious, and same way in Tel Aviv. The second factor is also Turkey. There is some sort of uncomfort that exists there in Arab capitals and Tel Aviv from Turkish activities around the region, the Blue Homeland Doctrine, Libya, Syria, Iraq. So these two factors, in addition to what Khalid, Miki, and Lucy said before, there is a recognition that the current status quo cannot be sustained. We cannot really hold that kind of strategic realignment based on a dream of having two-state solution soon. So that was the bigger picture. In addition to the fact that there already have been some sort of cooperation, cyber activities, intelligence sharing. Also, the Gulf countries want to have Israeli tech, cyber, drones, and most importantly, missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, the Iron Dome, given the fact that Washington has less Patriot and THAAD missiles being deployed in the Gulf. And we have seen Saudi Arabia having that agreement with Greece to bring Patriots into the kingdom. So there is a lot of interest that exists there, and Israel, for a lot of reasons, fit the narrative and fit the strategic realignment. So you end up with what we have seen last November.
Do you see other Gulf countries, following suit and signing agreements with Israel?
I think what I can say from far away that a lot of capitals are in wait and see mood. First of all, they are not sure about the political system in Israel itself, like what's the type of new government that will exist in Israel. I think that this is a major factor. Number two, what's the new moves coming from Washington, D.C. in that sense. And number three, they also want to see how the new Gulf Israeli peace agreements will unfold in the coming years.
And you mentioned, the issue of security. And just to reiterate, though, that Turkey has relations with Israel. They sent an ambassador actually after the accords. But on the security issue particularly, General McKenzie, the head of CENTCOM, was speaking last week, and he spoke. He mentioned collective security as one goal that the US is striving to in the region after the Abraham Accords, in having a more coordination, more security umbrella between the Gulf countries and Israel. Israel also had been admitted to CENTCOM after the Accords. Where do you see this security structure? Is that something that can come together in the short to medium term? And if not, if to other panelists, what are the differences between those countries? Do they really share a security view among themselves?
So that's a very excellent question. So the idea of an Arab-Israeli NATO has always been there. That's not a new thing. That has been proposed even during the Bush administration more than 15, 16 years ago. However, we didn't really have traction. Trump and Kushner tried to work on that idea. Again, there was less interest from Arab capitals at that time. We're getting there. It's definitely it's not a fancy idea anymore. However, it's going to take time. But also, let's decouple the Gulf from North Africa from Levant. These are three sub-regions with their own security interests and security challenges. Egypt, North Africa, somehow far away from what Israel and the Gulf perceive as a threat, Iranian threat. And I think that can be the base for, let's say, security coordination, intelligence sharing, maybe tech transfer, maybe joint military exercises that show Iran that there's some sort of military cohesion that exists that can respond to any sort of aggression. But that will be non-publicized, not really being called an Arab NATO for a lot of domestic reasons.
Miki, do you agree? Do you see an Arab NATO, an idea that was first started with Harry Truman? Actually, do you see that actually happening in the coming years?
Personally, I don't. I think it's going to be much more complicated to put it together. In concept, it makes sense, and you can see the argument for it. In reality, I think, as we've seen the region over the last several years, it's we have, and it's good, and you know, there's weaknesses and strengths to what I'm about to say. We have a collection of relatively young leaders who are bolder than their, or some would say bolder, some will say reckless, more reckless than their predecessors. So we see much more of swings right now. This might settle down a little bit if there is a stability from the U.S. beyond what, you know, beyond just if there's a sense of stability over time. But right now, everything you saw between you know, the going, you know, Saudi, UAE going after Qatar, then reversing it, we're seeing much more of shapes and moves than we used to see in the past.
Okay, Khalid, do you agree? And a question also from the audience. You know, a major reason that the Emiratis talk when they bring up the Abraham Accords is it actually stopped annexation of some areas in the West Bank by Israel. Do you see that off the table completely for now, or would Israel, you know, reconsider annexation of the West Bank in the future?
I think annexation is on the table. You know, they never really took it off the table in terms of formal annexation. What they did is, and Netanyahu has made this clear in the many campaigns that we've seen over the last year, that you know, it's suspended but not completely put off. But more importantly, de facto annexation is happening on the ground as we speak, with nary a word of opposition, certainly not from the Biden administration, hardly anything from Europe, very little from Europe, and remarkably nothing from the Arab world. You have evictions happening as we speak in Jerusalem, violence in Jerusalem, settler violence in the West Bank is an ongoing problem. Something like 5,000 settlement units were built just this year, and we're not seeing condemnations from the UAE or from the Arab states in general. And I think, again, it sort of reinforces this idea that, you know, they are moving on. They are post two-state solution at least in an ideological sense. They will continue to pay lip service to two states because you know, everyone needs some place to hang their hat. But in terms of actually fighting for two states, we're not seeing it from the United States. We're not seeing it from the Arab states. And the situation on the ground is deteriorating really, really rapidly. And so, you know, we're not seeing the kind of, you know, people who said that this would give the Emiratis and Arab states some leverage over Israel. That may be true theoretically, but they're not inclined to use it. And we certainly haven't seen them use it in any meaningful way.
But you know, you mentioned the situation is deteriorating on the ground. Given, you know, last week's decision by the PA to postpone indefinitely elections, how much is that a, you know, self-inflicted wound as well? I mean, with the PA and Hamas not reconciling, and now, you know, it's been 15 years, I think, since the last election. We're not even expecting one anymore.
Absolutely, I think it is a very much a self-inflicted wound. You know, it's not as if Palestinians don't face real external challenges that they need to become also their own worst enemies at the same time, and that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a divided and dysfunctional leadership. We thought maybe the normalization would sort of push the two main parties at least to set aside their differences. But, you know, you can never really underestimate the Palestinian leadership's dysfunction. So, you know, I think it is one of the many trends, and it's sort of it's self-reinforcing. When Arab states look at the Palestinian leadership, they see this division, they see this dysfunction. It makes them also not inclined to want to move ahead with two states. In addition to the realities on the ground and settlements, it is one of those trends that is working against two states. A part of it is self-inflicted, but also let's not forget that the Quartet in the United States for very many years, Israel certainly, has insisted on Palestinian division in the form of opposing Palestinian reconciliation efforts. Now, even the problem, of course, is that even when Palestinians decide to move ahead with reconciliation anyway, they still find these kind of petty reasons to these partisan and parochial reasons to not move forward. And I think the cancellation of the elections is another sign of I don't know any other way to put it, but a bankrupt leadership that has no strategic vision, that is incapable of even minimally doing what's required to put its own house in order. And I think we're not going to see a change at the regional level, at the diplomatic level, until that happens, until Palestinians form some kind of cohesive or at least coherent political entity of some kind.
I see Mickey, he has a comment.
Just jumping in quickly on this, because I always get a smile on my face when I realize how much of a mirror the Israeli and the Palestinian communities are of each other. And if you're looking from the Israeli perspective, mirror of what Khaled just said, and from an Israeli perspective, and there was a question about it in the little Q&A, you're seeing Israel in a deadlock politically, going through back and forth through elections on this. And this is a prime minister that just delivered 4 normalization agreements with Arab states and still hasn't been able to win enough seats within his camp to form a coalition. And so the challenge, even in Israel's politics, is looking, the electorate is looking more internally into governance and competency than they do to what is perceived to be an external threat.
So Lucy, given this paralysis, within the Palestinian dynamic parties and on the Israeli side now, what's fair to expect? I mean, somebody is asking, is it realistic that any peace plan can move forward without Hamas, Fatah agreement, and even without a fully formed Israeli government?
Yeah, thank you, Joyce. I mean, I think this is exactly the challenge where you're seeing the unwillingness to any of these actors to seize whatever leverage or opportunities might exist with the Abraham Accords and the subsequent normalization agreements. Is I think a lot of these actors look out at the paralysis in Palestinian, as Mickey now notes, Israeli politics, and say conflict management is just the way to go. They've been able to get away. We've been able to get away with conflict management till now, and it's risk aversion. You see some of the analysis pertaining to the cancellation or postponement of the Palestinian elections. There's been some analysis that there's a big sigh of relief from many of these actors, including actors like Egypt and Jordan and some of the Arab states, because nobody was clear where this might have ended up, these elections. I think you're seeing overall risk aversion. It's easy to say, let's just wait till we see what the leadership picture looks like on the Palestinian side and on the Israeli side. But we're now heading into maybe a 5th election on the Israeli side. It's taking a really long time to see what that picture is going to look like. And who knows when new dates will be scheduled on the Palestinian side. And so I think as these actors look at this picture as not changing anytime soon, let alone the fact that even if you have this uncertainty and paralysis in the Israeli political picture, the trends are clear. The trends are clear that the body politic has moved very much and largely to the right. And so any government that you might have in Israel is not likely to be one that's going to rush towards embrace of a two-state solution, back to the table, negotiating table straight away. And so it has been hard to see a way forward. If I can just go back to the question you'd asked and that Khaled was discussing on annexation, is it off the table? I agree largely with a lot of what Khaled said. And again, there's this, when the agreement was signed between the UAE and Israel, there was this split screen narrative of Netanyahu wanting to speak to certain members of his base, saying it's just been postponed. The Emiratis saying, no, it was, believe me, we were told it was off the table. I think the reality is it's not entirely clear that it was going to move forward anyway, and that the Israeli government actually sees it in its interest to move forward. And partly because if you look at where Israeli public opinion is, there's not some great rush. There's certain strong voices and advocates for it, but there's not some great broad rush or push by the Israelis towards annexation. In fact, if you look at different sets of polls on this, the reason many will give for not wanting to move forward is, why do we need to at this point? It only creates problems with our international partners. We don't really need it. The situation can continue as it is. And in fact, when polled directly around the time of the Abraham Accords, in terms of annexation versus pursuing a peace agreement or a normalization agreement with an Arab state, Israelis would have, by large numbers, I think close to something like 80%, would have taken, if it was an either or, would have taken the Arab normalization over annexation. So is it formally off the table? No. Do you have de facto annexation happening? Yes, but do you have, in terms of formal annexation, I don't see it necessarily moving forward. I don't see where the impetus is for that to move forward anytime soon. So again, you're stuck in this paralysis until, if I would just say last point, until these actors are forced to act, and unfortunately that sometimes means something very big and very negative happening. Khaled mentioned that there's been maybe nary a word from Arab states on various events happening, but you did see when there was violence in Jerusalem last week relating around the Damascus Gate area and the barriers being put up to Palestinians being able to get up to Al-Aqsa and those eventually being removed. The UAE did put out a statement condemning the violence by Israeli extremist groups in that context. And I think when I look at that, it's maybe easier for them to ignore making statements about what they see as quieter de facto annexation. But when things start to really heat up, particularly in Jerusalem and particularly around religious sites, it's going to be harder and harder for some of these countries, I think, to ignore what's happening or to avoid making statements. And so that, I think, is something to look for, the way these developments play out.
Do you see any emerging role for the UAE or one of the other countries that signed normalization to mediate between the Israelis and the Palestinians? Lucy.
Well, this gets back, I think, to one of the points I was raising before about Arab-Palestinian. So where is the leverage? Which actors here in this equation have the ability to play a mediating role between both sides effectively? And I noticed there was a question in the chat about the shift of center of gravity, I think, in the Arab world, including from Egypt. And this is where I think we shouldn't be counting Egypt out, because if you look, there certainly has been this shift in this more Gulf leaning shift you're seeing. And if you want to look at those power plays or looking for taking on that mantle of leadership in the Arab world, you certainly see UAE vying for it in the last few years. But in terms of long-standing relationship and leverage with as many of the relevant players as possible, Israel and the different factions on the Palestinian side, Egypt and Jordan as well, the original normalizers, or those with the peace agreements with Israel going back a long way, to my mind, are probably the more likely candidates in that regard. But I'd be interested certainly to hear from my other panelists on that as well. It looks like Khaled may have something to add.
I mean, actually, I wanted to go back to a point that Lucy mentioned earlier about conflict management being, with folks being okay with conflict management. The sad reality is that we don't even have conflict management. we have complete, I mean, there isn't any even minimal attempt at conflict management. I think in order to do that, you'd have to see some sort of regional or big power architecture emerge, something like the quartet, but not the quartet, because the quartet is a failed experiment, and has been dormant really for most of the last decade, if not longer. And so, this periodic violence that we see in Jerusalem, and we see how easily things can spill over from Jerusalem to Gaza, where we also saw rockets fired and then airstrikes, and it was almost like 2014 revisited, where events in Jerusalem spilled over into Gaza, and then we had 54 days of death and destruction. So without even a minimal process in place to contain violence, to keep things from escalating, I think we're in a really dangerous place. The parties are completely on their own for the most part, and really the only people who seem to care, beside the Palestinian leadership or Palestinians on the ground, is the European Union. But even they are not inclined to sort of put their money where their mouth is.
I want to go to Mohammed just, and then I'll go back to you, Mickey. But Mohammed, on the question of economic integration that we're seeing following the Abraham Accords, where there's been open tourism between the UAE and Israel. We're seeing cooperation in the fields of cinema, technology, restaurants offering kosher foods at some of the hotels in the UAE. How do you explain that jump? What does this economic front look like? And also to Sudan and Morocco. I mean, you mentioned Sudan got its share of loans, it's getting help, but what does that also mean for them?
Thank you, Joyce. It's very interesting you mentioned the UAE-Israel trade flow right now. Israel and UAE are very similar in some capacities. Both are tech hubs in their own way. Israel has a nation, cybersecurity, drones, AI, blockchain. UAE has an edge over digitalization, digital transformation, smart cities, and also wide-scale deployment of technology. In addition to the fact they are tourism hubs, they are small but very advanced militaries, close allies to Washington. So they have what brings them together. They are compatible in that kind of sense. So the current uptake and the flow of trade between UAE and Israel makes sense on paper. And we have seen how fast they move forward with that sort of cooperation. I'm not sure of that model, the Israeli-UAE trade flow or economic integration can be replicated elsewhere, because we don't really have the same thing. UAE has something to offer, has finances, huge GDP, it's Dubai, it's Abu Dhabi, they're global hubs for Asia and some extent emerging markets. Israel has that kind of edge. Also, it's very expensive tech. We're not speaking about cheap tech. So that kind of model cannot be replicated elsewhere, to your point. And also to pick on what Khaled did say before, people-to-people tourism between UAE and Israel is easier to happen. There are no 4 wars. Eventually, Egypt has a peace agreement with Israel, 4 years now. People-to-people tourism is not really a big thing. People-to-people diplomacy is not a big thing. We have historical narratives. We have still the memories of our fathers who fought in the wars. That's something that will always cloud any sort of relationship. It will take time. In the UAE or the broadly Gulf region, you don't really have that. You don't really have wars. You don't really have that kind of blood that define that relationship. So it's easier to move forward. I think in North Africa and the surrounding regions, it would be very hard. To your point about Morocco, I think Morocco is the most interesting case out of the peace agreements, not only because of the Western Sahara, that was a big achievement for Morocco, but also what kind of relationship that Morocco will have with Israel, given the Jewish diaspora, the economic relationship that existed before, the history. I don't know. I think, again, Morocco is also in a wait and see mode. I think they were very reluctant to move forward because they were not sure if Biden will uphold the Western Sahara recognition. I think since we have seen Blinken and the administration making it clear, at least for now, Western Sahara issue is settled. I think it will be very interesting to see how Morocco will move forward with that. Sudan also a very interesting in a very interesting situation. I think they have a lot of problems, and for them having an ally like Israel with a big sway, not only over Washington, but also over big international players from the Gulf to Moscow, that would be very interesting.
How so? Can you elaborate on Sudan, given their, this moment of transition and Sudanese politics? How much can they lean on the accords to improve their situation economically?
So first of all, they're trying to downplay the accord for now, given the transition, given they don't really have an elected government in place. So you have that when you talk to people from Khartoum in the transitional council, they say, we're in a wait and see mode because we're not sure about what's happening inside Sudan itself. That's number one. However, they see the strategic case for why relationship with Tel Aviv. First of all, they think that Israel might have some sort of influence that can be leveraged over the issues with Ethiopia, not only the Nile issue, but you have border tensions, you have refugee problem. So that's a big chunk of how they perceive Israel. In addition to the fact, they're also looking for a market. You're speaking about a country that was isolated from the international financial system for quite some time under the Bashir government. So they're looking for Tel Aviv as their own way into financial markets, investment opportunities, maybe cooperation. Sudan has a very troubling economic situation. So definitely any kind of economic support that they can get is a plus. Also, in addition to other fact that given how the Gulf is diverting away from oil and how oil prices are also limiting the scale and the influence of the Gulf that they once had, because they had a lot of financial clout to do that, they know that the Gulf is not as generous as it used to be for economic reasons, political reasons. So all these kind of factors make Israel-Sudan peace agreement a very, very interesting case to follow. But we're not sure where to go from here. Like all the deals that we mentioned right now, we talked about, again, they are still other than the UAE, still in transition mode. They're waiting for the new government in Israel. They're not really sure what's happening internally. So again, wait and see mode.
Okay, the final topic, and we have just 2 minutes to talk about it, the social cohesion that we're seeing also following the Abraham Accords. We're seeing, a UAE ambassador to Israel that's openly tweeting about his social engagements, about meetings with the Israeli public. We're seeing, besides tourism, that Mohammed mentioned, this cultural exchange happening between the two. Are any of you surprised by this? And is there a lesson from this for future agreements? Mickey, why don't I start with you?
Thank you. I'll try to be very, very quick to answer your question and then to go back to the point. Number one, yes, I'm not surprised at how much enthusiasm there has been, at least from the Israeli side. Israelis have been yearning to feel accepted in the region. So when that opened up, without, again, I think both Khaled and Mohammed mentioned it, like this is a community which we didn't have direct war with. So you don't feel that kind of cold front from this. They jump on it fully, they go there. On that, a cautionary note, when Israelis start touring other countries, it comes at a cost. See Israeli-Turkey relationship. Israeli tourists are not always well behaved. So that's just a little side comment on this. So I'm not surprised from the Israeli side on the excitement on this. I'm not surprised from the UAE excitement of this. We got snippets of that even in the time that the Israelis and Palestinians were advancing, and there was a big investment conference in Palestine, for that matter, and they were just coming in because they wanted to see, they were curious about this. Back on Muhammad, if I may, just one point on the economic side. The UAE, we had already 3 waves of UAE Israeli engagement on trades. The first one was Israelis jumping in, thinking, oh, you know, we're the startup nation, we're the brains, you, the UAE, are the wallet, and we'll do great things together. Now, if you're the UAE, that's not exactly something you like to accept. Like, no, actually, in so many ways, the UAE has an edge over, as you mentioned, Muhammad, over Israel in different sectors. And so after that kind of mismatch played out, we got the second wave of looking at the UAE as a market and a collaboration. Now we're going into the third wave, in which we understand that the UAE is not big enough to be a market. Israeli mindset is always global, is whether the UAE can become a gateway for Israeli products and Israeli companies to get into the region, and vice versa. So that's on the economy. And last point, I promise, Khaled, just to emphasize what Khaled said about the potential explosion that, you know, and center violence, not because of the Israeli internal politics, we now have straight out Kahana disciples inside the Israeli parliament, inside the Knesset. If we think that they're going to sit quiet and be moderated, we're a little delusional. We are going to have provocations, and that's just to reinforce what Khaled said. Watch out. If the parties are left for their own devices, we're going to see eruption of violence.
Okay, Khaled and Lucy, very quickly on the question of people-to-people relations, what lessons for future agreements?
I mean, I don't have too much to add to what's already been said, other than, you know, obviously with the UAE, the social engagement is quite intense and it is warm, very much unlike Egypt and Jordan and other places. And there have been a number of polls recently about popular attitudes in the Arab world towards Israel and normalization. And as we'd expect, you know, it's still, you know, Israel is still kind of a taboo subject in large part because of the Palestinian issue, but also because of these countries' own histories, bilateral history of conflict with Israel. So in places like Egypt and Lebanon and Jordan, you see very much very negative attitudes towards Israelis. I don't know, you know, I don't think we're going to see a sort of sweeping across the region, anything similar to what is happening with the UAE-Israel social engagement. I think for the time being, it's going to be probably limited to there because, you know, the Arab world is still adjusting, and the public, I think, is not quite ready to embrace Israel with open arms yet.
Okay, Lucy?
I don't want to be repetitive. I agree with much of what Mickey and Khaled have said. I do think UAE is a little sui generis in this regard. I think Israel does have incentives both on the economic front, the tourism front, the people to have this work and work well, because you want this is something being watched, right? This is a pilot and test case in some sense. You want this to build momentum for this kind of sentiment to be able to take off and become more normal across the region. I think it's going to take time. And I do think that this is for many of the reasons we talked about, particularly when it comes to what ends up happening in Jerusalem specifically. I think that is really going to be a wedge issue, which takes us back to one of the questions at the top of this hour, which is what is possible, what has changed? We're still seeing Saudi with all the encouragement it's clearly given, the winks and the nods to the other countries. Part of the reason it is still sitting on the fence is it's still a bridge too far. And I think this is a longer conversation we could all have. But again, I think there will eventually be no way around wrestling with this issue and the Israeli-Palestinian issue if you want to see the optimal change that these kind of very positive arrangements could bring about.
And this is an excellent note to wrap the conversation on, that the Abraham Accords enforce this regional paradigm shift, but with continued paralysis, with continued tension in Israel and Palestine, we could be on the edge of another explosion in the Holy Land. With that, I'm going to turn over the conversation to Megan. Sorry there's many insightful powerful questions in the chat, but we ran out of time. So thank you for giving me this opportunity this morning.
Joyce, thank you so much. And briefly, we just want to express our gratitude to Khaled, to Mickey, to Mohammed, and to you, Lucy, for helping us better understand the impact of the Accords, for meeting with us, emailing, and participating in our panel. Additionally, thank you to Professor Collin, who's been nurturing our project since last August, and to Professor Gerard for their leadership and support. Talia?
Yeah, we'd also love to thank the Middle East Institute for partnering with us to produce this extremely relevant panel discussion. And we'd also love to give a special thanks to Eliza Campbell, Ross Harrison, and Ambassador Ferrestein for their amazing guidance and support in helping us think through all of these really challenging topics. I can't speak for all of us, but we've definitely learned a lot, and we really enjoyed working with MEI over the past few months to make this event possible.
And lastly, we encourage you all to join MEI in celebrating their 75th anniversary of the founding day. And to commemorate, they will be hosting a panel reflecting upon the last 75 years of U.S. engagement and policies with regards to the Middle East and North Africa. It will be taking place this Friday, May 7th at 10 a.m. Eastern. So please join all of those